Hello, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Katie Tyler. Welcome to the Sociology Staffroom. We've got a wonderful guest today. Reece, thank you for coming on, first of all.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've actually been looking forward to it, and interesting enough, my students have been looking forward to it as well. So they'll probably be tuning in and listening afterwards.
Oh, let's hope so. Yeah. So, obviously, we're here to talk about controversial topics. But first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself before we sort of delve into our sort of main discussion today.
Yeah, so my name's Reece. So I'm currently a sociology and history teacher at Leeds City College. I'm also the subject lead for sociology. I've been teaching for about 6 years, mainly sociology and history, but I've also taught politics, international relations, and various other subjects too. So quite used to talking about controversial issues. My degree is actually in politics and history, and my undergraduate thesis was published, which was a discourse analysis using qualitative interviews looking at the role of collectivism within the British trade union movement. And I think the conclusion of that piece was essentially, after the analysis, was that trade unions had effectively been neoliberalized with a far closer focus on individualism and consumerism than traditional roles of collectivism. So that was led to quite a lot of interesting conversations when I was invited to talks to discuss that. I also did a master's degree after that, which was a master's by research, which was a little closer to sociology and philosophy. So I used postmodern methodological approaches, so like Foucault, Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, to analyze current discourses within the trade union movement, to look at the internal power structures and try and find a way out, really, as to where they were going to go or what alternative discourses are in there. So, yeah, quite a lot of postmodern theory. The other thing I'm really interested in actually about myself is I'm really interested in open access education, which is I think this podcast is a really, really good idea. So open access to journals, but also because I used to work in a lot of kind of retail jobs, or I know a lot of people in the trade industry. When I used to work as a student and before I became a teacher in those industries, I found quite a lot of people really interested in sociology, philosophy, and these kind of theories, but they wouldn't have traditionally picked to study those subjects at college or university. So I was inspired to start a YouTube channel, which I started in 2020, which is called Simple Philosophy. And the aim is to kind of simplify complex ideas that I used to talk about with these people. But I've ended up using quite a lot of that with my students because a lot of the theorists are the same. So the three most popular videos that we've got are on Baudrillard, Simulation, Simulacra, Mark Fisher. The video is controversially titled "Why There Is No Future," and I thought it would be quite funny to release it on New Year's Day back then. So that one's quite popular, and Derrida is quite popular. So there's a lot of hit on postmodern theorists, really. So yeah, so that's me, really.
Wow, is all I can say to the end of that sentence. Very sort of like, I'd say, rich and diverse experience and knowledge and passions as well, from what you were saying. And I'm thinking, I was smiling when you were talking because I think I mentioned before we came on that actually in the background is Duncan, who is our sociology lead. So a lot of our listeners will know Duncan Hall from Tutor to Tio. And I know his passion is all of those things. So I feel like I'm maybe not best fit to have this conversation. I feel this is one that maybe Duncan is itching to get involved in. But I would like to probably unpick your mind a bit more around your research. But like you said, in your own words, that you are used to teaching controversial topics or having those discussions, particularly with your political and sociological background, the research you've done, and obviously your sort of views around sort of maybe open up access and not that that's controversial potentially, but the fact that you feel that maybe education isn't open access for all, maybe. I don't know. I'm sort of thinking
Yeah,
about that maybe.
I mean, the reason why I really like working in FE is kind of for that reason, because many students that come to FE, whether they're returning learners or whether they are students that haven't chosen to go to sixth forms, and I'm not saying all sixth forms are like this, but for many of our students, they say the reason why they've come to FE is because they find it very prescriptive, both in the classroom and in general. So having a much more open environment is kind of where I thrive as a person, and I feel like a lot of our students thrive as a result. Um, so yeah, Yeah, I would agree with
Exciting! I feel like that's another podcast in itself. So maybe, like in the future, we can talk about that and sort of the have you taught in sort of a mainstream sixth form sort of thing before, or have you always taught in like FE?
I've taught it once before I did my PGC, when you kind of get the experience
Mm.
before, I kind of realised it wasn't really for me. But I've also done some university lecturing as well, so maybe I'm kind of more on that side, really.
Yeah. Oh well, the future's exciting, or maybe not, according to your podcast.
Well, yeah, according to
No.
Mark Fisher, there is no future. Which, interestingly enough, when students watch that video, they come back and they ask lots of questions. So, but maybe that's for another time.
Yeah, definitely. I think we'll definitely earmark that, and we'll put a link to that YouTube channel with the podcast for the listeners to watch, basically. So, first of all, the word controversial. I mean, that's a sort of a loaded concept in itself. Let's, in true sociology style, let's operationalise that. What does that mean to you? The word controversial.
Controversial. Well, the thing is, in the current kind of climate or social climate that we are in, I feel like it's a word that's kind of lost quite a lot of meaning in terms of what is controversial. I mean, if we look at what's going on in some of the American schools, where there's been the banning of books and texts that have been traditionally taught for quite a while due to alleged controversies, I don't know. It feels like it's kind of become meaningless. But for me personally, it's any issue that may potentially challenge somebody or maybe considered to be a taboo topic, which people aren't really used to talking about or engaging with.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose it depends what your makeup of your students are and where you're sitting, what is considered controversial. So, like you said, if it's something that the students aren't traditionally like used to exploring or might find difficult to explore, but that will vary from context to context potentially. So, question: controversial subjects, topics. Is it? Should it? Would you know? Are we supposed to be dealing with those subjects? Obviously, we are within the humanities. Um, is it should it always be covered? I suppose should we always delve our foot into controversy?
Hundred
Is that the
percent.
job? Okay.
I 100% believe that we should be doing controversial topics, and I kind of want to praise the AQA sociology specification there a little bit because it doesn't shy away from a lot of issues that we should be discussing, really, such as. I mean, in the belief topic, we talk about fundamentalism. In the family topic, obviously, domestic violence. And some people might feel, well, why are you talking to young people about that? But I genuinely think it's important that we do. Um, I'm sure most people listening, if they are teachers, or even if you have children, find that students are naturally curious about the world. And the ages 16 to 18 is when you are forming your identity about who you are, what you think about the world, or trying to understand it before you develop into adulthood. And whether we like it or not, students are going to engage these debates in one way or another, whether it's feminism and gender politics, which I know for a lot of my students is a big controversial issue that they want to discuss or they want to understand, whether it's climate change or an upcoming climate catastrophe, whether it's ideas of justice, such as the Black Lives Matter movement that happened a few years ago. All of these things students are naturally curious about. And the concern for me is if we don't talk about these things or have a space where students can talk about these things in a constructive manner, they will get their information from YouTube, they will get it from TikTok, they will get it from Facebook, although it's a bit of a ghost town nowadays. But depending on what they're looking at, the algorithm isn't really sensitive. So the algorithm will just pick up something that you're interested in and it will try to suggest similar videos, and it's very easy for students to start going down rabbit holes based on conspiracies like 15-minute cities or kind of racist ideas or Hillary Clinton being an alien harvesting children for adrenochrome and all of this kind of stuff, and it leads to a lot of misinformation. So I think it's really important that we do have a space where students can discuss controversial topics, and without drifting off too much, for me, learning you can learn quite a lot of things on the internet, and a lot of people have been saying to me, oh, AI is going to make you redundant in a couple of years, AI can tell us everything, it doesn't matter about you anymore. But I think these people forget that learning is a fundamental social experience, and I'm very much influenced by Vygotsky in that sense. But that's why I think it's important to have a space in the classroom where students feel open, where they can discuss these ideas, or maybe ideas that they might have seen on a YouTube video that they think is going to form their identity, and then listen to what other people say. I just think that's so important for our students, and I partly feel that we as teachers have a duty to discuss these things and not shy away, even if they are difficult topics.
Yeah, definitely. I think you said so much then. There's one word that I want to pick up on in a minute. But like you said, if we don't have these discussions, that could be quite challenging, maybe not always controversial, but sometimes challenging for students to get their heads around. That information is going to be found elsewhere, or it gets, for some students, suppressed. But then that's not particularly healthy either. That they may not even explore it, but then it becomes something different within them potentially, and may flare up later on in life or whatever it is. So definitely, but you reference the word space, and that's something I want to explore with you. So we're talking here with agreement, or you've said that you think controversy is something we need to explore within sociology, and as you've said, it is a feature of the sociology course, depending on what exam board you are. So it depends, everyone's got different ones, but most of the sociology will have an element of controversy within it, or discussion and debate. But then you talked about this space. So how do we construct a space where students can feel they can safely engage in those debates without feeling potentially victimised, or feel like they are unable to express themselves fully? How do we construct that space?
Yeah, it's always a difficult question, and I'm very conscious. Since I started my PGC, I'm creating classroom cultures, which can sometimes be quite hard to manifest. But the way that I've created a classroom cultures, and I've never had a problem in my experience, is from day one you lay the expectations down that we expect from students, and I let them know that we are going to be discussing these controversial topics, and to get them used to that as part of the induction, we talk about like polyamory and some of these taboo topics to get them used to it. So in terms of creating that classroom culture, I don't know if you've ever heard of an agonistic approach.
Oh no, explain more to me.
So it's kind of the idea of normalizing disagreement. So it's quite an old concept, but it seems to have returned back in some literature recently, which is the idea that naturally not everybody in the room is going to come to a consensus or an agreement, but we allow people to have their say or express that, and then engage with other arguments. So that culture for me is really, really encouraged. The other thing that I think is really important when we are creating these classroom cultures is the knowledge of the tutor. So I'm someone that kind of reads quite a lot of the news and tries to keep the content fresh and see what students are engaging with or what their interests are. So it's kind of tapping into that really and doing some reading and understanding around it. And the other thing as well is not to force debate or argument around controversial topics. So one of the most difficult ones that I would say to teach would be the domestic violence element that we teach on the specification. It is obviously a very difficult subject for a lot of people and difficult for people to talk about. And in that lesson in particular, it's important that we don't force students to engage if they don't want to. If the group's going to remain silent, then that's fine. You can just deliver both sides of the argument. But if people do want to contribute, it's about making sure that's managed in a fair and effective way, really. So yeah, that's kind of the principles that I use to discuss these. And I kind of build that very, very slowly throughout the year. So it'll maybe start by talking about different types of couples in the introduction, to then talking about sexism in schools and giving them literature on like Ofsted reports and problems and short BBC news articles, and asking them to develop on that. And then over the year, it tends to develop quite a supportive culture with each other, which is nice.
Definitely, and I think it's like you said, not forcing that discussion when it's the students are not feeling it, and I think it's being sort of, like you said, aware of where the students are at as well in their sort of journey of learning, but also willingness to share. You sort of mentioned obviously the sort of range of topics, and we're going to come to that in a minute, but I want to sort of think, other than I mentioned the word like maybe students feeling potentially victimised or something, like what other potential problems or not so much problems but potential concerns that we need to be as teachers, because we talked about creating a safe space, but anything we need to be aware of, particularly those new to sociology, that potentially could become a barrier for students engaging in controversial debate?
Sometimes there might be one student that tends to dominate, which sometimes happens, and they might be kind of spouting taboo positions. Normally, in my experience, when there is a student like that, they don't normally believe what they're saying, but they're normally trying to goad for a reaction. So, in that sense, I think this is where the knowledge part would come in. It's about challenging their views, and then usually students will then other students will tend to chip in to challenge those as well, to kind of let them know that that's not acceptable. There are obviously legal restraints on some things that we can talk about as well. So obviously with prevent agendas and British values and various things around that you do have to take a more firm approach, or speak to students afterwards, or just close down a debate. But to be honest with you, that's only ever happened once in my experience, and I think it's not to shy away from closing down debate when it's got a little bit too far, but normally you can talk students down or get them to consider other positions if they are doing that. And like I say, in my experience, most of the time they're doing it to be edgy, shall we say. So it's quite easy to take it down in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for us, the beauty of sociology, it's not, we're not talking about I think or this is me, that actually it's through the lens of a sociological theory. I know personally what I make sure is that I give them as students a theory, and make sure, like in small groups, that they're coming at it from that perspective. And then I try and switch it around. So like I'm very conscious the students have preferred theories, so I try and make sure that they don't get that preferred theory. You always like get their face goes when I get something they don't want to think about. But I always remind them that when it comes to an essay as well, they have to consider different perspectives. It's not going to be from the theory they prefer, but also it helps with the debate, doesn't it, to consider the other view that, like I think you mentioned, agnostic, like the one that you don't agree with, it does exist out there, and it will make for a healthier debate when you know that.
I was actually going to say,
sorry.
I was going to say, just kind of bouncing off that, actually, I completely agree. And it's a really good way of actually creating kind of like a neutral space by embedding it in theory. So a couple of students had a question about the Ukraine war when that started. And obviously that was something like, obviously I've not fully got my head around this situation as it kind of unfolds. So what we did is we did a theoretical comparison of functionalist approaches to war, and then Marxist approaches to war, and then postmodern approaches to war, and how they would each look at it, so students could kind of go away and think of it in that sense. I know we were going to talk about Andrew Tate at one point, but I'm going to talk about something similar when we get to that question.
Well, I was just about to come on to it. I mean, when we first agreed to talk about controversial subjects, at the time it felt quite apt to talk about Andrew Tate. I know that when I was teaching, that would seem to come up as the most controversial at that time, and that students really wanted to get their head around that. I feel like almost that, as sociology does, it's moved forward so much more, and I feel like I wrote a list of other ones that potentially are more challenging. You've mentioned already, sort of, I'm trying to sort of phrase it in a way that isn't loaded, but basically the variety of political perspectives within America at the moment is probably the most neutral way of saying it. So that's more relevant, and obviously we've had also within England itself. Immigration explored as well. I feel like there's been a lot in a very short period of time since we first talked about having you on the podcast and you contributing. So I want to be controversial. You choose which you'd like to talk about, because
there is so many. There's so many. Over the past few years, I mean, we've had quite a lot of challenging people, like Jordan Peterson when he was popular, and some of the stuff that he was coming out with, which just wasn't academically supported or backed up, and challenging those views. Kathleen Stock, more recently, who have actually now integrated into the feminism theory module as to talk about that challenge on gender identity and radical feminism, liberal feminism, and postmodernism. But I think the easiest one to talk about probably is the Andrew Tate one, because for me that was quite surprising when that broke out, because a lot of teachers didn't know who he was, and I don't think it was fully exposed, his influence on a lot of young men that we were teaching at the time, because I think for a lot of teachers, they're probably just not in that world of the gym bro influencer or whatnot, and
Yeah,
why a
it
lot of our
definitely got
students were
caught
drawn
me
to it.
off. Like, I think the students told me before, and what's even scarier, I think even younger than secondary school, knew of him because I've just put a thing out there. Like now, there's even like a child, like children have one to buckle my shoe. He's referenced in that, and the children don't know what that word means. They don't know what Andrew Tate means. So it's definitely, I suppose, the mass. I don't want to say appeal because it's not appeal, but I suppose for some young people it has been an appeal, hasn't it? I think it's far more stretched than anything else that it's outside of the sociology. I think for people who take sociology, they'll be aware of what's going on in America, like they'll be aware of immigration. But for something like Andrew Tate, that was across a whole breadth of people. But interestingly, I think I wasn't fully aware of the impact until you start teaching. You're like, wow, and then and it's like you said, young people, but young people were aware, and also people in their like 30s that I wouldn't have thought were particularly
Mm.
interested or concerned with that. Yeah, or 40s as well. So yeah, yeah.
I actually have a bit of an anecdote in relation to Andrew Tate round about that time. He came up in a lesson when we were talking about feminism and crime, and obviously a lot of the females in the room were saying, "Oh, he's a horrible person." These things that he says, and there was a young man in there who said, "Oh, so I quite like it. Some of the things he says, I can agree with." So obviously, all of the girls in the room just jumped on him for saying that, and he eventually kind of backed down when they were debating with each other, and it turned into a really good conversation because he said, "Okay, I don't agree with the things that he said in relation to misogyny, but he has a Bugatti." And that was quite interesting to me as to why a lot of these young men have gone into it. So I kind of then jumped in with the theory and I said, okay, well, we can actually link this back to what we're talking about and relate it to the crisis of masculinity. So within the crisis of masculinity, it's based on several elements. So there's obviously a lot of young boys from a young age in a very female dominated environment, where obviously there's lone single parent tend to be female. We have the feminization of education. And we also have the decline in masculine jobs, which has led many people or many young men to be confused about their identity. And it seems that for a lot of young men, they're stuck between two types of identity that they can fall into. There's either this toxic Andrew Tate's masculinity, where women are seen as something for conquest or something that should belong to them in a very traditional way. It's also about being successful and flashing your cash and being wealthy. And it's not just Andrew Tate that promotes these ideas. I mean, a lot of the music students listen to, people like Drake to an extent, although I think he's on his way out, or like Post Malone, or if you listen to kind of any male popular pop star or rapper, they tend to portray elements of this toxic masculinity. And the other one is a kind of that students are saying is this kind of like hyper feminized masculinity. And many of them feel that if they don't fit into either of these two categories, that there's nowhere they can go. So they kind of end up playing up into one or the other. But we had a really good conversation discussing that, and we also linked that to how that links to capitalism in itself. Andrew Tate, toxic masculinity, it's all kind of a product of the capitalist system and the pressure that you have to be successful, that it's a dog eat dog world, and that you have to be like that and be the alpha male or whatever nonsense that pseudoscience that they come out with. But it led to kind of like a really good, honest discussion that actually maybe we should have more of a conversation as to what masculinity is, and that if you don't feel represented by either of these, what is that to you? And I think that's a really important conversation that I think a lot of young men really want, but it seems to be harnessed by people like Tate or Jordan Peterson that has taken them down a road that I think a lot of them don't really want to go on, but they don't feel there's anything else there for them. So it was a really nice, healthy discussion. And it was a surprise that it kind of naturally occurred within the lesson. But I thought it was quite interesting, and it was
So
just a way to
like
neutralize it.
Yeah, so basically it came up from the students rather than from you going, right, today I'm going to do a lesson on Andrew Tate, that it something organically came out of the students, and then you constructed it through a theoretical debate. You mentioned obviously crisis masculinity and Mac and Gow, and then obviously sort of looking at capitalism potentially, and maybe even looking at, you know, the feminist movement as well. I don't know if you assumed you looked at that as well. So there's
Yeah.
sort of like, yeah, and so that's interesting, because sometimes it's the students that bring it forward to you rather than the other way around. And like you said, you've brought it right back to theory rather than shutting it down, which I think sometimes it's, if you're a little bit nervous or you haven't prepared for it or it wasn't in your sort of planning, then actually it'd be like, oh, we're not talking about that now. We've got to get on with whatever it is on the scheme of work. But actually allowing that space allows students to feel heard and valued. And they'll carry on, I suppose, if you put those foundations in place, they'll keep on coming forward with those questions. And it goes right back to what you originally said at the beginning. If they don't come into lesson doing that in a safe academic perspective, then actually there's a risk of them going elsewhere, that, like you said, that rabbit hole, or potentially suppressing that in some way. Obviously, you know, not every lesson we can, but I think if you give the space to it, I think that's definitely, like you said,
Yeah.
healthy in order to do that.
Yeah. I
You
mean,
look
for
like
me,
you're going to say something.
it kind of links back to my PG. So I've always had this idea, because I'm quite obviously Foucault influenced my PGC thesis or whatever, and it's about kind of like there's a book by Deleuze as well, which is on Spinoza, which is about when to accelerate or decrease your power, and sharing like the power that you might have in the room. So obviously, if I'm the knowledgeable other, it's been comfortable to obviously pass that down to other people that are in the room to be able to do that. Um, I mean, another example that we did recently was in the globalization and religion lesson that we did before the year twos left. And a lot of them had not heard of Modi or what was going on in India. So I showed them a video on Channel 4 News, and we had a debate. And then the next lesson, I think Modi had arrested some of his opposition, political opposition, and they all came in like, Reece, you know that lesson that we did last lesson? I've just seen on the news that this has happened. And yeah, I see what's going on. So yeah, and again, they get a better understanding of the content of the course by doing that. And I think they also leave as more well-rounded people, which I think is really, really what we want as part of our hidden curriculum.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd say definitely. My only question around this, and it's just me just thinking again as you were talking, I'm a big fan of going off and talking about things that are contemporary. I'm also conscious that for some reason the academic year just feels like it's a whirlwind, and before we know it, we're back at the end of year 13. How do you, I mean, I know this is not the conversation, but I think the sort of the nature of wanting to bring in, because the students are passionate about it, want to bring in debate from outside of the spec. Potentially, obviously, you can make those links, but then, you know, how do you then get that balance? Should you be getting that balance? Like you said, you want them to be well-rounded individuals. You want them to engage in the sociology specification and then make it applicable to something that's theoretical to real life. But then, how do then you balance that against the fact that before you know it, you're at the end of year 13 and you've maybe a week behind or 2 weeks behind. I'm thinking that even for my own sort of personal reflection.
Yeah, I mean, it does sometimes happen. I mean, sometimes you'll have the occasional lesson where we're like, right, we're going to need to get our heads down today, and we're going to need to cover a lot. So we've got knowledge organisers, and we're going to do this, and you can talk amongst yourselves, but we need to keep it focused and dry. Focused and engaged,
was
not
that
dry.
was that was that a Freudian slip
I mean,
there?
that was definitely a Freudian slip, because I hate those lessons where it's like, right, we just got to kind of wade through a bit of content to get through it, and then we'll discuss it later. But yeah, so yeah, sometimes you kind of do have to tone things down a little bit. But I think because they've had that engagement beforehand, having a little bit more of a kind of top-down, structured lesson, they appreciate that, because they know that we need to get through it. But a lot of it's down to kind of like planning and pacing and rejigging the scheme of work. So if you saw like my scheme of learning, there's just arrows all over where I've moved things around where this has happened, and maybe like condensing parts, or sometimes if it's a complicated topic, instead of doing the original task that or research task that I was going to get them to do, I'll break it down and explain it, because I know that I can do that quicker. So it's just about kind of being adaptable. To be fair, if for anyone that is listening that wants to be a teacher or is new to sociology, I think adaptable is probably the key word, and just kind of flowing with the students. And sometimes it's harder than others, and every year you panic thinking you're not going to finish the content, and somehow it just kind of magically comes together. I can't really explain how it happens. It just somehow does, and I'm sure you've probably had the same experience.
Yeah, 100%. Going into support of the sort of debates is there's the payoff, because obviously, sociology is so synoptic. So I was saying to the students, the other day, or not just the other day, but I say it to all my students, what you're learning now, you'll look again in year 13. So it's not like we look at it and never look at it again. So actually, sort of the payoff of looking at something, maybe looking at other debates outside or other issues, actually, it will help you understand it further. And actually, when you come to it the second time around, you might not have to spend as long as you think you're going to have to, the one that you've planned on your scheme of work. Like you said, it's rejigging. You can condense it because you think, oh, well, actually, I spent longer on that then. And so I don't have to spend as long this time on it. So I think, but the beauty of sociology is the fact that it is so synoptic. So actually, it's revisited lots of different times. So the core debates would be like, obviously, class, gender, ethnicity, revisited, and revisited. Whereas I suppose for other subjects, actually, there isn't the room to do that because it's all sort of self-contained. I'm just thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not just sociology. I've kind of the same thing in history. So a couple of weeks ago, we were doing about the Pale of Settlements, and quite a lot of students didn't really understand why anti-Semitism was so embedded in Europe at that point. So I actually planned in a kind of 20-minute overview and introduction to kind of the history of anti-Semitism, which I'd use various, obviously approved sources to discuss. But by doing that, it actually gave them a far better understanding of the content that they were looking at. And I also think it's always worthwhile giving students the power to actually discuss these things. And I'd rather not take that away from them for something that might be a bit stressful, but I think it's worth doing that condensing to give them that say and that ownership of their own work and their own classroom and their own environment. And it sounds like you're on the same page as me, so that's good.
Yeah, I suppose there's not a right and a wrong, and I suppose if you're new to teaching as well, I think you want to keep to the sort of specification and the guidelines as much as possible, because it's until you've worked through it once, you don't really know how it all flows until you've got to the other end. You're like, oh, well, we've looked at subculture here, we've looked at it here. And I mean, like, I teach cultural identities, so we look at subcultures in, obviously, education, we look at it in cultural identity, we look at it again in crime. So by the time the students get to it, they're like, I know this inside out now. So, but until I think you run through it, I'm thinking of new those that are training, then sometimes you don't really see the whole year until you've taught it once. But yeah, like you said, you somehow get there. And then the main thing is the students enjoy it, I suppose, as well, which is clearly what you aim for your students. I could talk to you forever about all these controversial, and we weren't that controversial either, were we? We were not.
No. I mean, there's still time. I'm happy to do it, but yeah.
Do you know what? When I was younger, I was really controversial in the sense I was quite like, I thought this. When I say young, I'm talking about 16 years old. And that's why I think, thinking as now as a teacher, as an adult, that when you're that age, like you said right at the beginning, you're more likely to be exposed to those views, and you're like, not controversial, but you're like quite rigid in your thinking because you've only had a little bit of time on the earth, so you've only got your head around one school of thought, and you're like, right, that's it. And then there's obviously something that happens in your thinking. You're like, oh, then there's this, and there's this, and then there's this. And obviously that's when I fell in love with sociology, because I had my thoughts and then it was able to explore lots of others. I think
kind of just bouncing off that a little bit as well. I mean, when I was younger, it was kind of like in the early days of the internet where the servers weren't as big. So in order to kind of get internet clout or gain some kind of attention on the internet, you had to have quite a lot of engagement or your post would disappear forever. And I feel that this has created an environment even to this day where saying really like extreme or offensive things or having extreme opinions on sociological debates or issues kind of becomes the norm in terms of what you're engaging with. Even if you think about some of the kind of slang that our students use now when they call someone a man a simp or something like that, there's kind of a sexist connotation within that. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying. When you're young and you've only been exposed to these views that you think are kind of normalized or whatnot, I think that plays a role too. But if you don't mind, I'd quite like to talk about one of my influential teachers, which is very similar to what you were saying. So my history teacher, my old history teacher, who I'm still actually friends with, is a brilliant
What
guy.
is it? Always history teachers. Like my
We're
most
just
influential
crazy.
teacher is I literally was a history teacher. Like I obviously that was it, and it got me started to think about different debates and different perspectives, because obviously all you have is the narratives at that point of your small group of friends. I wasn't brought up in the internet era, so I literally had my like 10 group of friends and my, I don't know, my family, and then that's it. That's the perspectives you had, and then you were like, oh, everyone else does it differently. That's really interesting. That's how my brain went. And it was a history teacher that was like opened my mind up that some people do it this, some people do it like this, some people do it like this, and I love that. I love other people's perspectives. But yeah, that was just interesting. It's always a history teacher for some reason.
Always the history teachers, but this one history teacher had. So we used to have in like last thing on a Friday, which is always like the death slot, like for anyone. And he'd come in, and he wouldn't do it like a normal lesson. He'd put his chair in the middle of the room, he'd cross his legs, and he'd just
Oh,
start
phew.
going
I
on.
thought we were going to do a back to, when they put their chair back to front. I'm thinking, please don't do that. Please don't do it.
No. He's kind of proper old school, but he'd sit there and he'd go, right, Trotsky. And it's like, I thought we were doing Nazi Germany today. And he'd kind of go off about like Trotsky and the merits of his argument. And then he'd kind of bring it back to Nazi Germany. And he'd looked at it in a way that I just would never have considered when I was 16. Like the ideas of like Marxism, or even if he took like a feminist approach, he'd kind of take that Friday lesson as almost like a story time, but it would be the content from a completely out there perspective that I've never heard of before, and I just found that so engaging. I always kind of joked to him like, I didn't really learn huge amounts about Nazi Germany, but I learned a lot about Trotsky from you. But yeah, just him doing that was really really inspirational, because he just opened my eyes to like so many different ideas, and I think for both of us, that's probably why we try and do that with our students now, that we don't shy
Oh,
away
yeah.
from it, because we want you to see the kind of complexity of the world, or as Deleuze, like a multiplicity of the world, as Deleuze would put it.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think that's the thing. I think it's always remembering, like that's why I mentioned being 16. I think that was a very, very long time ago, but I think sometimes remembering even though obviously there's the internet and there's a sort of range of perspectives, I think actually with echo chambers, it's actually you're not really getting that much of a range of perspectives. And so I think it's always remembering, like when you're with a 16-year-old, they're not intentionally, or there might be, like you said, the one students are trying to be intentionally controversial to sort of create a debate. But actually, most of the students, they're only 16. Do you know what I mean? And it's the first time they're exploring those debates. And so actually, it's being mindful of that when you're introducing debates, that they're not, maybe there's no intent by saying something. It's just that they're expressing a thought and actually haven't really thought it through that much. And actually, it's now the chance to look at it from different perspectives. And like you said right at the beginning, creating that safe space. And obviously, we're lucky with sociology that we've got theories and the lens to look at that through. So, yeah, I'd love to see a fly on the wall in your lessons.
I think one thing that I kind of do as well is normally you'll have a group that'll normally skew. Based on what you were saying, they'll normally skew either left wing or right wing. So what I'll purposefully do is kind of poke the bear and just take on the opposite persona to try and get them thinking of that opposite, which normally encourages debate too. I don't know if you do that as well.
Yeah, I do love it. If the students are not feeling too tired, my experience is a hot summer's day, maybe less so, but I like to do a bit of a human bar graph and put them up. And if I notice there's a sort of a bit of a polarisation on one side, I might stand on the other side just to pose a perspective, really. And then if I don't get that, like I said, I often give students the theory, so they're forced to think of that perspective. But yeah, it's just, I think sometimes, what do you think da-da-da might say about that? And they're like, not really sure.
I'm a little bit more devil's advocate with it, you see. So, like, obviously, we've got Charles Murray behind me, who's on the wall to goad students anyway, because normally he's quite controversial. So, obviously, his discussion in family, I'll be like, oh, well, he's got a point, though, hasn't he? And then they're like, no way. And then that kind of brings it out. So, I quite like poking the bear in that sense.
Oh, I'm not that I'm not that controversial.
As long as it's tasteful, I'm perfectly happy to poke the bear and just like, see what comes out, really.
Yeah. Well, I think, we've all got different teaching styles and different perspectives, and I think that's really, really healthy in order to do that. I think if we we're all the same sort of teacher, it would be quite a boring experience for the students. With and variety is the spice of life for sure. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need more like eccentrics as well, really, because I think what you were saying before is if you might feel quite nervous if you just follow in the spec, but I think these eccentricities is kind of what stays with students and gets them engaged as well.
oh, definitely. Or if we're
Yeah.
sitting down in the middle of a classroom with a chair next week. So, no, actually, I do love a tangent. Don't get me wrong, and I'm conscious that I will probably eat up all of your morning talking about this. But I'm definitely going to get you on again. I want to talk more about your podcast and your YouTube channel, and I want to talk to you more about all your sort of ways of you sort of open access to education. I think that's really interesting and exciting. So yeah, you'll be getting a message from me soon.
Oh, that
Thank
sounds
you.
brilliant. I've really enjoyed this chat, actually. It's like, I was a little bit like, is it going to be really formal? But actually, I think it's devolved into a kind of a proper staff room conversation, really. I just kind
Well,
of think it's
that was the goal. That was the goal. I must admit, I can link sociology into both things somehow. I'll weave it into a staff room conversation. Even a maths teacher will end up talking about sociology by the end of 15 minutes with me. So thank you ever so much for your time, and all the best, and enjoy your summer holidays, most importantly.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hopefully I'll see you again.
Yes, please. Thank you. Take care.
See you later.
Bye.